Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
So much for being here. Many of you have returned all 4 weeks, and that's lovely to see, not only for me, but also for our esteemed presenter, who I will now introduce, Dr. Lee Dugatkin.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, and I also echo Tony's appreciation for folks who came every week and folks who have coming for the first time as well. And so tonight we're going to do this topic of evolutionary medicine. When Tony asked me to do this course, he said we're going to do it for 4 weeks in a row, and I knew that I had to do the first couple of lectures, the kind of overview, and then a lecture on speciation and extinction. Behavioral evolution is my own forte, and I definitely was planning on doing that. And then the last one was open, and there are many different things that we could have talked about. I chose evolutionary medicine because it's one of those rare things. It's I would argue something relatively new under the sun. This discipline that also goes by the name of Darwinian medicine hasn't been around all that long. And of course, it's always difficult to pinpoint when a new subdiscipline comes into existence. But one good place for this might be when this book called Why We Get Sick, The New Science of Darwinian Medicine was published in 1995, I believe it was. And it was published by two of my colleagues, Randy Nesse and George Williams. And the interesting thing here is George C. Williams was a legendary evolutionary biologist of the 20th century. Sort of makes sense for him to be involved in something like this. Randy Nesse is actually trained as a psychiatrist who became absolutely fascinated with evolutionary biology, and the two of them wrote this book called The New Science of Darwinian Medicine. And I'm just going to show you a quote from the New York Times magazine when this came out, because I think it captures a number of things about the discipline. Again, here they're calling it Darwinian medicine. Sometimes we call it evolutionary medicine. So the Times review of the book holds that there are evolutionary explanations for human disease and physical frailties, just as for everything else in biology, and that these insights can inspire better treatment. And so what we're going to do is look and see how thinking from an evolutionary perspective can help us better understand disease and what we might be able to do about it from an evolutionary perspective. I'm going to start with a simple question, which is, what is it about disease that we want to explain in evolutionary medicine? Illness itself is rarely, if ever, an adaptive trait. Now, we will talk about a possible example later on, but generally speaking, illness is not adaptive. You would never expect natural selection to favor any system in which illness was prevalent. What we want to explain from an evolutionary perspective is why it is that we, and more generally all organisms, are still vulnerable to illness. And so we're going to take a slightly different perspective than we've taken for the first 3 weeks, in which over those 3 weeks we've kept over and over showing the power of natural selection to shape the world we see around us, the traits in the organisms that we see around us. Here, what we're going to do is we're going to ask, given that natural selection is so powerful, how is it the case that we are so susceptible to so many physical frailties and diseases and illnesses? Can evolutionary biology help us explain why that's the case? And also, can that information help us, in some circumstances at least, to deal better with whatever the medical issue that we're talking about is? So what we're going to do for the the vast majority of the lecture is trying to answer this question. Why have these vulnerabilities to disease persisted despite the operation of natural selection? And to do that, we're going to look at 6 possible explanations. And these are not mutually exclusive. All of these can be going on at the same time. Some of these I'm going to spend more time on. Some of them I'm going to spend less time on. So the first possible reason that we're still vulnerable to disease is that we are in what's known as an evolutionary arms race with pathogens, with generally speaking microorganisms that are causing disease. And when I say an arms race, I mean an arms race in the sense of the old United States-Soviet Union arms race. Each side is trying to build up more and more weapons so that they're safe from and can defeat the other side. When it comes to an evolutionary arms race, pathogens are selection is always favoring ways for disease-causing organisms to be good at what they do, cause disease. At the same time, selection is always operating on hosts like us to make us less susceptible to disease. But in this evolutionary arms race with microbes, single-celled organisms particularly, that are pathogens, we generally lose that arms race. And the reason that we lose that there's a couple of reasons we lose the arms race. One is that pathogens evolve so quickly compared to, say, humans or any mammal, right? Our generation time is 20 years. Pathogens can reproduce in an hour, which means that they will have tens of thousands of generations for a single generation that we have. Evolution, therefore, can operate much more quickly over those tens of thousands of generations. The other thing is that disease-causing organisms tend to exist in huge population sizes. We'll look at this a little bit more later on, but millions, billions of disease-causing agents can be infecting a single patient, depending upon what your disease you're talking about. That also facilitates really quick evolution because you get lots of mutations. Some of them might help those disease-causing organisms get better at causing disease. And so as a general rule, we lose this arms race, and that's one reason why we're still susceptible to disease. Now, before I said the book I mentioned, This New Science of Darwinian Medicine, might be a good launch point to say, here's where the subdiscipline of evolutionary medicine starts. The one exception to that is that for a very long time, with respect to antibiotic resistance, people have thought in terms of evolutionary medicine, even before that terminology was around. And so we're going to discuss antibiotic resistance as an example of us losing this arms race. Okay, so ever since we started using antibiotics, physicians know that one thing that happens, and it happens relatively quickly, is that whatever it is that we're trying to stop disease-wise evolves antibiotic resistance to the drugs that we put out there. So the first modern antibiotic, penicillin, clinically introduced in 1943, was really, really good. Right? It really knocked out many, many disease-causing agents. Within a single year, penicillin resistance was observed in some species of bacteria, meaning they could live and reproduce in the presence of penicillin. After just a year on the market, there was some resistance. Within 5 years, this resistance was found in lots of different bacterial species that cause disease. Since penicillin, there are any number of new antibiotics that have been put into the market. And every single time we put a new antibiotic out there, it's only a matter of time before antibiotic resistance evolves. And this is also true for antiviral. We produce antiviral substances that are meant to knock out viruses versus bacteria. The same thing holds true there. But This is a table, and it needs to be updated because it's from an earlier edition of the evolution textbook that my colleague and I did. And all it's meant to do is show you a bunch of different antibiotics that have been introduced, when they were introduced, and when resistance was observed. Usually it's very fast. In some cases, it can be a bit slower. Over and over again. This is a huge problem for us. This is a huge problem. The only way we can understand the evolution of antibiotic resistance is to understand it in the context of natural selection. And to show you that, we'll walk through an example. Before we pick a particular antibiotic, again, keep in mind the following things about whatever the bacteria we're looking to knock out is. They reproduce at an astonishing rate. So a single gram of human feces or feces of any animal can contain trillions of bacteria. Another thing to keep in mind as we do this is that antibiotics impose what we should think of as very strong natural selection pressure on whatever microbes we're trying to get rid of. So if you think about a predator out in the wild and whatever prey it's chasing, that predator is very, very dangerous, right? It can take its prey, but not every predator is successful at every attack on every prey it does. But when we first introduce antibiotics, they will often knock out 99.99% of whatever the microbe is. That's incredibly strong selection pressure. The antibiotic is the predator here, and it's killing almost everything. This creates really strong natural selection pressure to somehow overcome that if you are a disease-causing bacteria. So let's imagine we're tracking the evolution of resistance in one antibiotic that's called ciprofloxacin. Ciprofloxacin. It's often referred to as Cipro. That's what I'll refer to it as. Right, so this is something that's been around for a while. It's prescribed for lots of things. One of the things that it's prescribed for is food poisoning caused by this bacterial species. The bacteria does really well in the intestines of livestock, and it's benign there, but it can cause acute food poisoning in us. Okay. All right, so imagine now we're tracking the evolution of antibiotic resistance in Campylobacter jejuni, the organism that's causing us, that's creating food poisoning for us. So at the start of the process, a single patient who's infected with Campylobacter may have millions or billions of Campylobacter cells that are going to be exposed to our antibiotic, Cipro. Okay. And that's just one patient. Might have millions or billions of copies. Many patients get sick. Right? Early on, Cipro was, in fact, really good, killing almost all, if not all, of the Campylobacter cells that a patient had in them. But each one of these Campylobacter cells can reproduce really quickly, right? On the order of hours. And you have millions and billions of them in a single patient. Okay? What that means is it's only a matter of time, maybe days, maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe a couple of years, before a mutation appears that creates a strain of Campylobacter, what we're trying to get rid of, that is somewhat resistant to Cipro. And it doesn't have to be super resistant. Right? Imagine that we have a mutation and it makes our Campylobacter cells, gives them a probability of surviving of 5% when they're blasted with Cipro, compared to 0% if you don't have the mutation. Again, think big. Think millions and billions of these cells in a single patient and then multiply that by lots and lots of patients. If you have this mutation, you are far, far better off as a Campylobacter cell, even if you only survive 5% of the time. When you have millions, billions, trillions of them, right? That means that a patient treated with Cipro, the resistant strain can outcompete the susceptible strain. When I say the susceptible strain, I mean the strain that doesn't have the mutation. It's always going to win because it lives. 5% of those cells live. 0% of cells who don't have the mutation live. That means that resistant version of Campylobacter will eventually become the dominant form. That's all you'll see because they're always outcompeting the cells that have a 0% probability of surviving in the presence of antibiotics. So now what you have is a strain of Campylobacter that's resistant, but only 5% of the cells are. Okay? But the thing is, the process that we just described starts all over again. Now the entire population of Campylobacter contains this mutation that gives you a 5% probability of survival because it took over the strain that had 0% probability of survival when antibiotics were around. But eventually, another mutation is going to occur. Another genetic change is going to occur in a Campylobacter cell, producing a strain of Campylobacteri that's even more resistant. Maybe this new mutation makes that strain 10%, survive with 10% probability rather than 5%. Now all of a sudden, that strain will outcompete the strain that survives with 5%. And in no time, all the cells are going to be that strain that have a 10% probability of survival. So then everybody's that. Just a matter of time before another mutation occurs that provides more protection, and the process happens over and over and over again, and we end up with strain of Campylobacter that is highly resistant to Cipro. The same thing applies to any antibiotic, any disease-causing agent that we're talking about. The only way to make sense of this is to think about natural selection. Selection's favoring any strain that survives with a bit higher probability in the presence of this initially incredible predator, Cipro antibiotic. And then it favors a strain that's even better, and even better, and even better. And before you know it, our antibiotic isn't good anymore.
So can I add something from a healthcare perspective?
Sure.
So then all it takes is people who go, well, I feel better, so I'm not going to take the entire course of the antibiotic.
Right.
And then
Right.
it takes whatever else happens. And then they take antibiotics when they're not really needed.
Yes.
So then you add those human factors into it. And then what I always just go is, well, then the bugs get smarter than the drugs.
Yeah.
And the nomenclature, that's just
Yeah. Yeah.
If you don't even look at the science piece and people go, and then you take people who are compromised, just physically compromised, who can't fight off anything, no matter how many drugs you give them, and it just, you don't even take into natural selection, you take in all that other stuff because the natural selection stuff has already happened. And it's just
Yeah, that's a good point.
sicker and sicker and sicker, and eventually the drugs aren't.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. And there's a lot that we could go off on that with that. No, because I mean, for example, this is also an issue for things like buying antibiotic-resistant soap. See, so I mean, the reason you have to think about antibiotic-resistant soap, and again, think about it from the perspective of whatever it is that you're trying to kill, whatever the bacteria is you're trying to kill. What you're doing with this antibiotic-resistant soap is getting rid of sort of the weakest bacteria, the ones that are in fact least dangerous, which means what you're leaving are the ones that are more dangerous afterwards. Yeah. So, okay, so now again, we're going to now discuss just a little bit. Once we understand how antibiotic resistance evolves, we can use this in this example to help us a little bit dealing with the health threat from, in this case, the Campylobacter, right? And just generally, now pharmaceutical companies understand this in a really deep way. And what they do in the course of drug development is they will expose thousands, tens of thousands of different variations of a particular antibiotic they might use, right, to bacteria and look for the antibiotic that in fact seems to be the one that's most difficult for the bacteria to evolve antibiotic resistance against. In the end, we lose no matter what, but we can at least slow the process down. We can at least try and use antibiotics that we know from screening. It seems to be, and we'll never know exactly why, but it seems to be these are really hard for the microbes to evolve resistance to, or harder. So we'll lose at the end, but at least the drug will last longer. And if you've ever gone into or seen one of these pharmaceutical research laboratories, it's all robotics, and essentially what they're doing is they just have vials and vials and vials of these different potential antibiotics that are being exposed to a host suite of different bacteria, and they're trying to pick the ones that will last the longest before in the end antibiotic resistance becomes prevalent. Another thing is physicians will often prescribe antibiotics in combination if possible, because that means when resistance evolves in one, at least you have some protection from the other. And finally, in the case that we've just been talking about here, where this disease is benign in the guts of animals, but can cause us all kinds of problems with food poisoning, what people are beginning to realize is that you need to be careful just pumping antibiotics into the food of your cattle or sheep or whatever it is. And again, sort of for the same reason that we just talked about with the soap. You're essentially getting rid of the weakest things and leaving the most dangerous, who can handle whatever antibiotics you have there. And also, you're building up antibiotic resistance for things that are dangerous to animals and are also dangerous to us. So in the case of Campylobacter, it's not dangerous for the animal, but it is for us. Many things that are dangerous to animals also are dangerous to us. When you feed antibiotics to your cattle and so on, what you're doing is you're building up antibiotic resistance even before the microbes are coming into humans. And so we're trying to use this sort of information to help us deal with antibiotic resistance. That was just the first of the 6. We're going to go much faster, okay? So why have vulnerabilities persisted despite the operation of natural selection? Another example is that selection hasn't had time to deal with the rapid changes in our own environment, particularly over the last 10,000 years, when we moved into a kind of much more industrialized, urbanized lifestyles. But even if you think on a more recent scale, so imagine early human evolution. It's hard out there. Besides all the things that are trying to eat you, and besides the fact that it's hard to find someplace safe, it's hard to get food. And in particular, it can be difficult to get things like sugar that produce energy for you, and you want energy. And so natural selection favors a gustatory system that responds really positively to sugar, right? Because you don't get it, so if you encounter it, you want to respond very strongly and take it in when you can. That's all well and good when the ability to get sugar is in a world where it's really hard to find that stuff. Now, fast forward to today, where you can walk in and get as much sugar as you want instantaneously. And you understand why we have problems with diabetes, why we have problems with obesity. We were selected to respond really positively to the tastes of sugar and other things. That works in an ancestral world, but when you can get that in unlimited amounts, you still have the craving for it. And that can lead to trouble. That's another reason we have to deal with medical issues, even though natural selection has been operating. Another one is that basically the laws of physics and the laws of biology impose trade-offs on what an organism can do. So what I mean here is something like this. Again, think about our own evolutionary history. Now, one of the things that we need to be able to do besides getting food is getting away from things that want to use us as food. right? So we have to escape predators. If you want to be able to escape predators in a world that's pre-industrialized, you got to be able to run. That's how you get away from stuff, okay? If you want to run, it's good to have relatively light bone structure so that you can do that. The problem with relatively light bone structure is bones break much easier. And that becomes even a greater problem as you get older. The thing is, this is where the trade-off comes in. If you had thicker bones, they would break much less often. But you couldn't have been able in the past to have moved quickly. And you can't have thick bones and thin bones at the same time. And so what you end up is with a trade-off. And in this case, being able to run away seems to have been a more prevalent, stronger force than occasionally breaking a bone. And so we end up with relatively light bone structure. This leads to problems as you get older. It leads to the occasional broken bone. But there's nothing that you can do because you can't have strong bones and weak bones at the same time. You can't have thick and thin, a bone thick and thin at the same time. There are trade-offs. Here's something that we're going to go into in a little bit more detail. Again, why do we see problems even though selection has been operating, natural selection has been operating so strongly? So natural selection is this process that we've been talking about. It lacks foresight. Natural selection doesn't know what's going to happen to this organism in 100,000 years, what the world's going to be like in 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years or 10 million years. Selection operates in the here and now. If it's 10 million years ago, the here and now is 10 million years ago. If it's now, the here and now is now. There's no foresight. What that means is sometimes, this isn't all that common, but sometimes you get stuck with historically contingent relics from the past. This is another reason that we have to deal with medical issues. Here, my favorite example, and I give credit to my co-author Carl Bergstrom for this, deals with choking. So again, remember, evolution is a historically contingent process. We don't know, natural selection doesn't know what's going to benefit the organism in the future. Okay, so just a quick refresher course about breathing and eating, okay? So if you're not swallowing, the esophageal sphincter muscle is contracted and the epiglottis is up, so you can breathe, right? So you can move air down to your lungs. Next, the swallowing reflex, when you eat something, causes the esophagus to descend. The larynx moves up, tips the esophagus down, and that prevents food from entering the trachea. You don't want food in your trachea going down to your lungs, so you close off the path to the lungs. And after you've eaten, then you open up to the path to the lungs again. When this bloody, awful system fails, you choke. And I was stunned when I learned how many people every year die. This is, if you were an engineer, there's no way in 1,000,000 years you would build this system. It's just awful. It's so susceptible to these kind of problems. So how do we end up with this? Why, in fact, don't we end up with this incredibly simple system that if you were an engineer, you would build in a moment that basically has two separate unconnected paths, one that takes air to your lungs and one that brings food to the stomach? Why all that incredible Rube Goldberg stuff that's going on in our own system? So here's where the fact that natural selection can't look into the future becomes relevant. If you look at a developing mammal embryo, including our own, in our own species, lungs are formed when what's known as a little respiratory bud extrudes from the developing esophagus. There's your esophagus. There's this protruding respiratory bud. And what you're doing is you're looking at its development, the development of this over time. And by the 8th week, you have something that looks like lungs. Okay? Now, a kind of primitive pseudo-lung can be found in early primitive fish from hundreds of millions of years ago. And when it first arose, it arose as a little pouch off the esophagus that served to trap gas bubbles. Right? You're swimming around in the water, you're going to be able to get your oxygen from getting gas and moving it into your body and into this little pouch of esophagus. But when this first arose as an offshoot, there was really no risk of choking because lungs were basically a backup system to gills. They were a secondary backup system to get oxygen. Most of the oxygen you get is through your gills, but you can also use this primitive esophageal pouch to also get some oxygen as a backup source. Later in tetrapod just means four-limbed. Later in four-limbed vertebrate lineages, we lost lungs when organisms came out of, organisms that evolved on land lost lungs, lost gills, and lungs became the sole source of our ability to pull oxygen in. So the thing is that because lungs and because lungs and the process by which they are generated arose as an extension of the esophagus, you still see now in mammalian development that little esophageal bud developing into the lungs. It didn't evolve as a separate organ originally, but that's what it is now. Our lungs are a separate organism. And the thing is that because they're so tightly connected, because the lungs bud off of the esophagus, you can't easily break that system apart once it's in place. Early on, you didn't need to break it apart because it was only a backup system and choking almost never happened. But now, where it's the primary system, the lungs and the esophagus are so tightly connected that you really can't break that system apart in any easy way. You're stuck with it. By being stuck with it, you end up having the system we have instead of this kind of system. So it's the evolutionary past. What happened hundreds of millions of years ago when the first steps towards lungs first emerged in a primitive fish species. That's essentially the reason today why we and other mammals have this awful system that we have in place. Developmentally, it's extremely hard to pull the lungs and the esophagus parts to separate them once they've been linked over hundreds of millions of years like that. So we've done 4 reasons now why we're still vulnerable. Another reason is that, so let me stop for a second. So far we've been talking mostly about sort of disease-causing organisms and real significant medical problems like choking. But there are other things that we suffer that are not diseases themselves, but that are medically very unpleasant. So nobody likes to get a fever. That's associated with being ill. But fever is not an illness. Okay? Nobody likes to get nauseous. But nauseous is not a disease. It's a symptom. Nobody likes anxiety. Anxiety is not a disease. It's a symptom. All of these things may be unpleasant to experience. And so we're talking about things that we don't want to deal with, just like we don't want to deal with getting sick from microbes and we don't want to choke to death. But in this case, this is the one exception to what I've been saying so far. These things, it turns out, certainly fever and nausea, and arguably, and we're not going to get into this argument tonight, anxiety, are in fact adaptations. They're things that were selected for. Right? Fever defends your body when it's being invaded. Nausea often expels really, really nasty stuff. And I'll focus on those two. Again, if you want to know more about anxiety from an evolutionary perspective, come up to me afterwards. I can send you in the right direction, but we really don't have time to do that one. So we'll do fever. Okay? All right. So first of all, you'd be stunned how many organisms run fever. It's not just a human thing. Like when organisms get sick, they run a fever to defend, and it's a defensive mechanism. And in fact, ectotherms, what are known in everyday language as cold-blooded organisms, they actually run fevers as well. Now that might sound a little strange, because in a warm-blooded organism, what that means is that you keep your temperature at the same normally. You may run a fever if you're sick, but you keep your temperature constant. Cold-blooded organisms adjust, their temperature is affected by the weather outside, by the temperature outside. But it turns out that even cold-blooded organisms can run fevers, but they run what are known as behavioral fevers. So here's a lizard. I don't remember what species it is. People were looking at behavioral fevers and demonstrating them in this species of lizards, and here's what they did. So they put a lizard in a little aquarium here, right? There's no water, but it's a terrarium with sand on the bottom. The lizard's really happy, and there's a temperature gradient inside here that's caused by this heat lamp up above there. And generally speaking, if you just take a lizard or a bunch of lizards and put them in here one after another, they tend to sort of move around, so they keep their temperature around 38.5. So they explore around, they learn where it's really hot and where it's cooler, and they tend to keep their temperature at a constant around 38.5 degrees Celsius. They like that. That's where they feel most comfortable. Now, if you infect a lizard with a microbe, a dangerous microbe, a bacteria, but in this case the bacteria was killed, but the lizard still responds to it as if it's a dangerous bacteria, what you find is the lizards end up spending the vast majority of their time over on the warmer side of the terrarium. They can still move around. It's not just that they're so lazy that they don't move. It's that they preferentially spend their time in the warmer area. What they're doing then is they're creating a fever. They're raising their body temperature, which tends to help fight off infection. They can't do it the way that we can, but they can do it behaviorally. And the way they do it behaviorally is just going over and spending time in warmer areas, creating a behavioral fever. If you look, you see fever run whenever there is, in almost any organism you can look at. So basal temperature is just your normal body temperature. And here's fever temperature, right? So if you look at humans, our basal temperature tends to run over here in this range. Our fever temperature tends to run over here. This is in Celsius. You can look at this in horses and dogs and pigs and mice and rats. You can also look at it in lizards, like I said. Again, they're dependent on the outside temperature, but they can move around and create their own average, they can set themselves up so that they can keep a body temperature that they like. But that body temperature is much higher when they're running a fever, when they're infected with something. You see this over and over again. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into fever here. So everybody knows that there are lots of things that we can take, generally antipyretic drugs that can reduce fever, makes you feel better. Also turns out that there are lots of studies that show that when you reduce fever using these drugs, it takes you slightly longer to recover, which sort of makes sense. I mean, you're basically ramping down your defense system slightly. It makes you feel better, but you're ramping down the defense system. And so it increases time to recovery and increases mortality for really dangerous diseases when you artificially lower body temperature using these drugs. So if that's the case, right? If lowering your body temperature, in this case through drugs, reduces the time to recovery and increases all kinds of nasty stuff, then why don't animals just run the equivalent of fever temperatures all the time so that you're constantly protected against these things using the same defense mechanism? Why don't you do that? And the reason is that at least in warm-blooded animals like ourselves, fever is really energetically expensive. It's really energetically expensive. A 2 to 3 degree increase A 2 to 3 degree increase in fever increases metabolic costs by 20% in some species. Shivering, which produces a kind of fever in many species, can increase metabolic rate sixfold, 600%. So it is really expensive to run what we think of as fever temperatures. And so even though it does defend us against lots of nasty things by basically creating an environment that they don't like, it is an expensive thing to run all the time. And so you don't see organisms, we don't normally run a 102 degree fever, even though it would in fact potentially help us fight off various diseases much earlier. And fever is this really effective way to fight off infection. No question about it. Now, the thing is that because it's so expensive, we might only expect to see fever when infection can't be handled by any other mechanism that the body has. So if fever is really good, but it's really expensive in terms of getting rid of disease. So because it's really expensive, we might expect that we would only see the body mounting fever when all the other ways we have to fight off disease don't work. Then we'll go to the most expensive one. But sometimes we all know that we run fever in situations where the infection that we have caused by whatever microbe can in fact be dealt with in less expensive ways metabolically than fever. And the question is why? Why is it that we run this really high energy expensive response sometimes when we don't need to? It's really good, but it's really expensive. So why not only run it when you have to, not when there are cheaper ways to handle potential infection? So to answer that question, I'm going to introduce this notion that a colleague of mine, the fellow Randy Nesse, who I mentioned right at the book, who was at the beginning, who was one of the co-authors of the book, who was a psychiatrist interested in evolution, came up with this thing called the smoke detector principle. And the smoke detector principle is going to help us understand why it is that sometimes we run a very energetically expensive fever when in fact we have less energetically expensive ways to handle the disease in question. So if our immune system was perfect, we would only see fever being used when it's absolutely necessary, when nothing else that's cheaper will fight off the problem. But when infection hits, sometimes our body doesn't have enough information for the immune system to gauge exactly how dangerous this disease-causing agent is. If it could, it would only run fever when it had to. But of course, we don't have perfect information when the disease is first encountered. Sometimes you have imperfect information. And that imperfect information is going to be the key to why it is that we sometimes run a fever even though we could deal with the disease in a much cheaper way. Now, this smoke detector principle. So imagine you have a smoke detector, right? And if your smoke detector doesn't work, there's two reasons it doesn't work. The first one is known as a false positive. So you're cooking a hamburger, your house is not on fire, but the smoke is enough that it causes a smoke detector to go off when there's no fire. Especially a kind of over-the-counter cheap smoke detector will sometimes go off when there's no fire, right? That's a false positive. In the context of what we've been talking about, a false positive is your body producing fever when there's really no need to. There's no fire, there's nothing that can't be dealt with in a cheaper way. But talk to any designer of smoke detectors or anything, and they will tell you that false positives are much less costly than false negatives. The one thing you don't want is a false negative. You don't want the alarm not sounding when there is fire. And so when you're gauging it, right, you want it to be very sensitive. You don't want it not to go off. Similarly, not producing a fever when it's the only way to fight infection is much so is much more costly than this. So this is much less costly than this. So what you're trying to do is design the perfect smoke detector, or the perfect way the immune system can deal with the problem. The thing is that there are these two ways that it might not work. And what you want, if you can control it, is to absolutely minimize this and occasionally deal with the fact that what's going to happen is this. That's what it is when we run a fever when we don't need one. It's a false positive, but that's way worse than a false negative. And so again, we have another explanation for why it is that we still have to deal with these medical issues that one would think maybe natural selection should have dealt with already. And in this case, even though fever isn't a disease, it is an unpleasant thing. And we would think, well, selection would minimize these unpleasantries. But the problem is the problem that we just talked about here, which leads to us occasionally running fevers when we don't have to. I think I'm going to make this the last one tonight, so we can have just a little bit of time, and we might get it out a little bit earlier. Well, let's see. So number 6. Why do we have these problems? Because selection favors reproductive success, even at the expense of vulnerability to disease. Selection isn't maximizing your health at age 70 or at age 16. Selection is maximizing lifetime reproductive success. Normally, that will mean that you'll see all sorts of adaptations to fight off medical frailties and diseases. But at the end of the day, all that matters is that the traits lead to high expected lifetime reproductive success. So what I'm going to show you now is an example of the fact that selection is always favoring maximal expected lifetime reproductive success, even if in fact it does make us vulnerable to certain medical problems. Normally that doesn't happen, but there are instances that we're going to look at where it does, and it'll help us explain why it is that we have to deal with these medical issues, even though they're so nasty. So to do this, I'm going to focus on senescence. Senescence is often used as a synonym for aging, but it's not exactly a synonym for aging. What we're going to look at is the evolution of this thing called senescence, and it refers to the general decline in physical functioning or performance of organisms with age. Why do we slowly break down as we get older? Why do we have an average lifespan of, whatever it is for males and females, 70-something and maybe low 80s? Our parts can last a lot longer than that. It's not that we're physically breaking down in the sense that the parts don't work anymore, but in fact, we do get frailer and frailer with age, and we do become susceptible to more and more physical medical problems as we get older. Why? Why do we senesce? Why does anything senesce? Why do these problems become greater and greater as an organism ages? As you senesce, your mortality rate goes up, and you have fewer babies. As you get older and older, after you get to the age of reproduction, as you get older and older, right, your mortality rates increase, and your fecundity, the number of babies or offspring that you produce, goes down. Why? Oh, a more technical definition for senescence would be that it's a decrease in the probability of survival or reproduction from time x to time x plus 1. In other words, if your probability of dying is greater when you're 65 than when you're 64, then that's an example of that's a kind of senescence. Your probability of dying is increasing as you get older and older. Your probability of dying when you're 80 compared to your probability of dying when you're 79. And as we get older, our probability of dying goes up. and our probability of reproducing goes down. And that's a more technical definition of senescence. And the vast majority of organisms do senesce. As time goes and they get older, their probability of surviving decreases and their probability of producing offspring. Their probability of survival decreases and their probability of producing offspring decrease. But there are organisms that don't senesce. So if you look at hydras, and you look at a hydra at 1 month old, and 2 months old, and 3 months old, and 4 months old, and 5 months old, its probability of dying does not change from month to month. And the number of offspring it produces does not change from month to month. Of course, eventually it dies. But suppose its probability of surviving from month 1 to month 2 is 20%. And then month 2 to 3 is 20%. And 3 to 4 is 20%. And 4 to 5 is 20%. That probability isn't changing, so they're not senescing. Eventually they'll die, but they're not senescing. And so the question is, why do we see senescence when it's possible, in principle, not to have senescence? Yes?
Just describe what a hydra is.
Oh, so it's a tiny, blanking on the word that I'm looking for here, polyp that people have studied forever in the laboratory. They're aquatic and very, very small and they're a kind of polyp.
These deaths are saying they eventually die. Are they some other natural cause?
Sure. Well, right. So while I'm
keel over something and there's no degradation, it just ends.
No. So what I'm saying is just that there's lots of things that can kill a hydra, but when we say it's not senescing, we mean that the probability of them surviving those things from birth to age month 1 is 20%. The probability of surviving those things from month 1 to month 2 is also 20%, and so on and so on. Eventually, whatever these things are, get them. But
external.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to look at the evolution of senescence. And to do that, I have to introduce this technical term, pleiotropy. All I mean when I talk about pleiotropy is this. Many, if not most, genes don't just affect one trait. They affect lots of traits. And so if a gene affects more than one trait, that gene is called a pleiotropic gene. That's all it means. It's a gene that affects more than one trait. It might affect bone density and hair follicles, or bone density and the number of offspring that you have, or the number of offspring that you have in something else. All that matters is for a gene to be a pleiotropic, it has to affect more than one trait during the lifetime of an organism. One way that you get pleiotropy is that a gene affects 2 traits that I'm just calling 1 and 2 here at the same time during the organism's life. So the gene kicks on, and when it does, it affects trait 1 and trait 2 at the same point in time. The more interesting kind of pleiotropy, and the one that we're going to focus on, is, again, the gene affects 2 traits, but it affects 1 trait early on in development, so here's time, and another trait later on in development. That's also a kind of pleiotropy. The gene affects more than 1 trait, it just does that, it just affects them sequentially. 1 trait early and 1 trait later in the organism's life. This kind of pleiotropy is going to help us understand why it is that we senesce, or why it is in general that things senesce, but also including humans. The hypothesis for this, here's our word pleiotropy, a gene affects more than 1 trait. I've stuck the word antagonistic in front of it. I have antagonistic pleiotropy hypothesis. What makes it antagonistic is that the gene affects 2 traits. One of the traits it affects positively. The other one, it affects negatively. And so there's an antagonism between the effects on gene 1 and on gene 2. So to understand this, the 2 time periods I'm going to focus on to get this idea across are the gene affects one trait during peak reproductive years. So, in humans, 16 to 25 or something like that. If you look at on average when most people have the most children around there, that's the gene affects one trait, and it's during that time, or during peak reproductive years. In us, maybe 16 to 25, and other organisms, obviously something different. The gene affects another organism, another trait, and it affects it later on, past those peak reproductive years. So in our case, maybe this gene affects the second trait when you're 40 or 50 or 60. So a gene affects multiple traits, pleiotropy. They're antagonistic, which we'll look at in a minute. One of the traits it affects is during reproductive years. One of the traits that it affects is much later in post-reproductive years. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at, will natural selection favor the combined effects of the two traits? So we're going to go through this step by step. If the gene has a positive effect during peak reproductive years and a positive effect during post-peak reproductive years, then of course natural selection is going to favor it. All the effects are positive. Selection will favor it. If the effect of the gene during peak reproductive years is negative, and the effect after that is negative, then it's also easy. Natural selection's not going to favor that gene. All right, now it starts to get interesting. What if the effect was negative during peak reproductive years and positive later on in life? Well, in those cases, right, we would expect natural selection to operate against this gene, because the negative effects are happening during the key evolutionary thing, producing young. The negative effects are happening later when you're not doing that as much, if at all. So if you think about 50, 60, 70, there's hardly any reproduction in humans. None in, certainly very, very little in women, and very, very much, and very, very little in men. And so the effect, when it happens, even if it's positive, it doesn't really have a big effect. But if it's negative when you're producing offspring, then that's a huge thing, and you would expect selection would not favor that gene. This is an example of antagonistic pleiotropy. The gene has one effect negative and one effect positive, but here we don't expect natural selection to favor it. Now, the last combination, what if the gene has a positive effect during your peak reproductive years and a negative effect later? Then, under some circumstances, we might expect selection to favor this. If it has a big positive effect when you're pumping out babies, and a negative effect later on, maybe when you're 60 or 70 and you're not doing that anymore, then selection should favor that trait. It's antagonistic pleiotropy. The effect is positive on one trait and negative on the other. But overall, we would expect natural selection to favor such a gene. Now, imagine this happening, the same process happening on tens of thousands of pleiotropic genes. What you end up having is a buildup of negative effects later on in life. Positive early, negative later. This effect is so strong that allows that this sticks around. And if this is occurring here in one gene, it might happen in many, many pleiotropic genes. And so that helps us understand this buildup of negative things that occur as you get older, this senescence. And so people who study evolutionary medicine now are beginning to do things to try and test this idea. And they're testing this idea, and this is, I think, a good example, and we're going to stop on this one, after this one. This is a good example of how we have people doing things that they never in a million years would have done if they hadn't thought about this from an evolutionary perspective. So, if you look at what people who understand this idea and also our medical doctors are doing, they're doing studies like this. They're having people who have diseases that are particularly associated with old age, Parkinson's besides early onset, right? And other such diseases, right, that are typically manifest themselves, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's that manifest themselves later. Can we understand this as sort of this buildup of negative things that occur because there's so much positive selection over here in the early years? So how do you test this? Well, here's where you would do something you would never do in a million years if you hadn't thought evolutionarily. What they're doing is they're bringing in patients who have these diseases, okay? And then, of course, they have a control group, same age, as similar as possible in terms of statistics, but who aren't suffering from these Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. And what they ask them to do is just fill in these surveys about information. But what they really want to know is, on average, do people who develop these diseases that are associated with older age have more kids when they're young? Do we see evidence that we're dealing with genes that are manifesting themselves negatively later in life, producing these diseases, but who are manifesting themselves positively early in life when reproduction is going on? And so do they have more kids? This is something I can't imagine anybody doing if they hadn't thought about the problem from an evolutionary perspective. So just to finish up then, and just refresh you on the things we've done. One reason we still have to deal with all these headaches is that we're in an evolutionary arms race. We tend to lose it. Another is that selection hasn't had time to catch up with the environment. The sugar intake example. Trade-offs, the bone example. Natural selection lacks foresight, the choking example. Some things that are unpleasant are in fact adaptations. Fever, and a much deeper understanding of fever. Why it is that we run it, why it is that we don't run it, why do we run it when we don't have to? And then finally, selection favors reproductive success. That's what the antagonistic pleiotropy idea is driving home. It's actually, the gene is being favored even though it has these negative effects later in life, because the positive effects early in life are stronger. And so what evolutionary medicine does is it helps us understand these things. And we've seen in at least 3 instances how it might help us better tackle whatever the medical issue is that we're dealing with. There are so many other things that we could do in evolutionary medicine that we don't have time to do. I will, if any of you are interested, we are lucky enough in my department at the University of Louisville in biology, we have one of the world's leading experts in evolutionary medicine, Dr. Ewald, who actually teaches a class on evolutionary medicine where you would get so much more than we've been able to do in one lecture. And you would understand things like how to deal with malaria and cholera and other things like that from an evolutionary perspective. Many, many, many other questions that we just don't have time to deal with. So again, his name is Ewald, E-W-A-L-D. Also, if you're interested and you can't take his class, Paul has a number of really good books. One that's kind of meant as a Barnes & Noble book for people who are interested and want to read it sort of as a bedtime book. Doesn't have exactly a bedtime book title, Plague Time, but it's actually about the evolution of infectious disease. And so, you know, you can get Paul's book, probably, I mean, it's 20 years, no, that one, I don't know, is maybe 10, 15 years old, so you could probably get it for like a nickel on Amazon. So if you're interested, you can find it there. All right, so let me just say again that I really appreciate everybody coming for whatever number of lectures you came, and I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'm happy to now take some questions on this one. Okay? Yeah.
I just wanted to see if I understand this correctly. When we choke, it's our attempt to stop food from going into our lung. Is that right?
No, so when I say when we choke, what happens is that system that we have doesn't work, and food goes down the wrong pipe. It goes down the trachea into your lungs. That's what choking is.
Oh, okay. So,
Yeah.
Because later on in Parkinson's disease, people often get food in their lungs, which causes them to have pneumonia or die.
Right, right. I don't know much.
That musculature kind of.
Right, right. So that's another problem with this system, but that wasn't the one that I was focusing on. Let me just, 1 second, Tony. Let me just see if it, yeah.
going back to the conversation about fevers, you had mentioned, why don't mammals in general just keep a fever all the time? I wonder, I don't know if there's a way to check this, but over the course of history, have humans' basal temperature, has our temperature gone up? Like if the basal temperature now is 98.6, then in 1500, was it 95.6?
Yeah, well, so I don't know the answer in general. I know it wasn't, I'm 99.9% certain our basal temperature hasn't changed 3 degrees in that short a time. But I don't know if our basal temperature has changed, let's say, over longer evolutionary periods. I don't know. I don't know if people have done it. I'm just trying to think about. Yeah, it's just, off the top of my head, the biggest problem is that's a really hard thing to gauge from the fossil record. And it's also a hard thing to gauge. I mean, that's so precise that I think it would even be a hard thing to gauge if you knew genetic change, if you knew the genes that were associated with producing, increasing fever temperature. I just think it would be a really hard thing to do. That doesn't mean that people haven't figured out a smart way to do it. And I think it's a great question, but I don't know. You might expect that, the kind of world of pathogens that we're dealing with now is not the same as the world of pathogens 10,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago, and so on. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was something, but I just don't know. Yes? Yeah.
The antagonistic hypothesis.
Right.
I think that could be affected by, now granted this is more societal, but like people delaying having children past their quote unquote prime years, like people that are having children in their 30s or their 40s. Does that sort of mess with that hypothesis, being out of the prime years?
So I think that certainly, the average age that humans have begun reproduction, at least, let's say, in industrialized societies, has certainly gone up significantly. I don't think it's a problem for the antagonistic pleiotropy, at least not on the surface, because essentially what one needs to do is then re-gauge what peak reproductive years are, right? And so I think it will change the outcome, right? Because now genes that are causing positive effects, let's say at 30 and 35, that wouldn't have been having this huge effect on the positive side because most people were reproducing earlier. Now they will have that, they will be more strongly favored. So I think it's going to change which genes are favored, but it's just sort of, you have to re-gauge what you're defining as peak. That's why I use those kind of generic terms. Peak reproductive years, post-reproductive, peak reproductive years. It is changing in us, and so the genes that will be favored or not will change.
But then just to add on to that, so then like puberty starts earlier sometimes.
Yeah.
So then maybe the peak range might be longer.
That's why, so it could be. That's why I mean, yeah, whatever that range is, I think in industrialized societies, it is true that puberty starts much earlier. But again, this is where cultural norms become really strong, right? That might be the case, but cultural norms are certainly very strongly against getting pregnant when you're not 10 or something. So I think that, right, whatever those peak reproductive years are, that's the key, and you would imagine they would change over time. Did you have a question? Yeah. No, I thought behind you. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The phrase "starve a cold, feed a fever," is that where that comes from? Or takes more energy? Or you said having a fever costs more.
Yeah, I think when
you get more energy.
So yeah, I think when you have a fever, it is true that you want to make sure that you can generate the energy to produce, to keep that fever if you need it. I don't actually know, the technical etymology of the phrase, but I wouldn't be surprised. Yes?
I don't know if you remember a
several years ago when Volvo was testing their cars, they would crash it into the wall and have a dummy in there.
Yeah.
So the question in some ways is about a socio-technical system. And if you strap into that driver's seat one of these bacteria or viruses, whatever, but if you're trying to get the information as that entity experiences it, how do you separate out in the emerging language the sociology of what it means, whether you're perceiving it through the filter of the technology, trying to read what is actually happening in that crash, or to try to realize a better, healthier, medically sound, supposedly, community.
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, I would say it doesn't matter at all, because when we're talking about microbes that are causing this, so bacteria, for example, that are causing these diseases, and we're talking about selection operating on them, we're in no sense suggesting that the bacteria are trying to become more antibiotic resistant. There is no socio-cultural component to what the microbes are doing. Of course, there's a socio-cultural component to what we're doing, but there isn't one on the microbes. It's just natural selection operating the way that it always does. If you're a little bit more resistant to a predator, that you do better than if you're not resistant to the predator. We impose all kinds of technical and sociological constraints or openings in a different way. But from the microbes perspective, that's not an issue.
Right.
Yeah.
So can we assume that bacteria, the ones that are attacking, also in their own ways is something that creates?
Say it one more time.
Something that causes their mortality to rise. So,
oh yeah, right. Oh yeah, sure.
can you speak at all to how medicine has tried to harness, if they have tried to harness those organisms?
Yeah. So the question is, I think, if I'm right now, tell me if I'm wrong, that we're trying to get rid of the particular species of bacteria, but they also have to deal with all sorts of natural predators that are trying to get rid of them as well, and all kinds of selective pressures. Yeah. So I think this is still relatively new, as far as I know, like maybe the last 10 years or so. There's a lot of work, and I think initially it was really generated by people who study evolutionary microbiology, that shows that bacteria produce antibiotics as well. Not to themselves, but they produce substances that kill other bacteria because that's who they have to deal with. And we're beginning to understand those antibiotics, and I think people are trying to figure out, is there some way that we can tap into that knowledge for us to construct particularly good antibiotics? Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe viruses or something that is competing and trying to.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever organisms they are.
Right.
Competing with the bacteria.
Right. So you could do the same thing, right? So and certainly viruses are a huge problem for bacteria in terms of mortality risk. And so they produce chemicals that try to keep certain viruses away and bring in certain viruses. And the same logic would apply there.
And phage therapy is a legitimate thing, using viruses that kill the specific bacteria.
Yeah.
Antibiotics.
So phages and all this stuff are certainly, I think, yeah. If I understand that there's a really bizarre but interesting history about the use of phages to fight disease, and I think there was something to do with Russia, but yeah. Phages are unbelievable. I mean, again, if this was my class, in my graduate class in particular, we would sort of discuss whether viruses are actually alive or not. But we really don't have. I don't think we really can get into that here, but whatever they are, they are powerful. All right, well, thank you all again. I really appreciate it.